Welcome back. We want to continue thinking about designing and redesigning your module. Again, your 15 weeks with your students. What's going to happen during that time frame. We've talked in the last video about learning goals and how we use Bloom's taxonomy and so on and so forth for thinking about learning goals, but we're not done with Bloom's taxonomy yet. We want to talk in this video about feedback and assessment. So the next part. Backward design, recall, we actually start in terms of designing a module with identifying learning outcomes, learning goals, etc. Again, Bloom's taxonomy comes into play. We're going to find Bloom's taxonomy has to be consistent here as well. Determine acceptable evidence of learning. So this is what we're going to talk about. We need to address certain questions along the way. What kinds of tasks will reveal whether students have achieved the learning objectives that you have identified for them? What kind of tasks? What is the evidence that students have achieved the learning objectives you have identified? So what would they do, and then what's the outcome there? How are you going to use that evidence to determine did they learn or not? Any assessment that you have for your module should reveal how well students have learned what you want them to learn and not learn something else. Two types of assessments that we want to think about in a broad sense. One is summative assessment of learning. This is to evaluate student learning. Evaluate student learning. It comes at the end of the learning process. So think your midterm exams, your final exams, term papers, things like that. They had to do some research to do a term paper, so they did a lot of stuff in terms of learning, but then at the end you're giving them, at the end of their learning process, you're giving them, or they're writing this paper. Typically these are high point value, high stakes, high risk. If I'm taking one of your exams and I get a question wrong, you're penalizing me because I didn't get that right, or I did not remember the answer, or whatever the case may be. They're high risk for students. Typically high point value compared to the total grade. And summative assessment of learning asks, did you learn something? Did you learn what I thought I was teaching you? That's what that basically is going on there. As an aside, when you're writing final exam questions, so on and so forth, you need to make sure you go back to Bloom's taxonomy. It will help you wording those questions so the student really understands what you're asking them to do in that question. Always go back to your Bloom's, always match up that assessment, how you write those questions with your learning goals. Okay, the other type of assessment that we want to think about is formative assessment of learning. This is monitoring student learning. It occurs during the learning process. So summative occurs at the end of the learning process. This occurs during the learning process. It's typically no or low point value, low stakes, low risk to the student. Maybe only a few points there. If they miss it, if they get it wrong, it's not impacting in a very major way their final grade. It asks more, instead of did you learn something, what exactly are you learning? And you may find they're not learning what you thought they were supposed to be learning. Again, remember, this is occurring during the learning process. Some examples: develop concept map, identify defining features, minute papers, etc., etc. Some of these we're going to go through. These are called classroom assessment techniques. I'll talk about those just a little bit more in a moment, but also then give you specific examples in later videos. So we're using these as a formative assessment to monitor student learning occurring during the learning process, in addition to your summative assessments. Okay, whatever the assessment that you're using, you need to make sure that's aligning with the learning goals. Remember, with this model, all these three components here are intertwined, they're integrated, so they match up with each other. So you have a learning goal and you're not asking them to do something entirely separate or different from your learning goal, for example. You're not teaching something here or having an activity that has no relevance to the learning goal or the feedback and assessment part of this model. So when they're misaligned, that can cause some issues. A couple of examples. Example number one, your objective in teaching is for students to learn to apply analytical skills. But your assessment only measures factual recall. How does a student think about that? Not very much. Students hone their analytical skills and are frustrated that the exam or assessment does not measure what they learned. They learned this, and you're asking them to do something else. Example 2. Your assessment measures student ability to compare and critique. That's the assessment. Compare and critique the arguments of different authors in this particular example. But your instructional strategy focuses entirely on summarizing the arguments of different authors. Again, a misalignment. The students do not learn or practice the skills of comparison and evaluation that you're going to test them on. To be more simplistic about this is the way I think about this. If you teach at this level, let's say you're teaching at the understand level, do not ask them to turn around and analyze on the exam. You must teach them how to analyze. If that's really your learning goal, if this is your learning goal, then that's the level at which you're going to assess their learning. But you do not teach them at this level and turn around and assess them at another level without teaching them how to do that. If you want them to be able to analyze, you must teach them how to do it. They do not walk into your classroom automatically knowing how to do these upper level thinking skills, use these upper level thinking skills without you teaching them how to do it, particularly in the context of the content of your module. Okay, so formative assessment of learning, there's a lot of techniques that could be used to do these kinds of things. This particular set is called Classroom Assessment Techniques. They're from this book, Classroom Assessment Techniques, Handbook for College Teachers. This is the second edition. Notice there is a first edition available online. It is really not, frankly, it's really not worth you looking at. Unfortunately, this one is not, the second edition is not online. So what I've done is these memory matrix, categorizing grid, defining features matrix, concept maps, what's the principle, project paper and project prospectus. I've copied those and given those to you in your PDF handout. And we will talk about several of these in some of the videos. These are the actual activities that you're doing as formative assessments of learning during the learning process. So let's very quickly review the two types of assessment. Summative assessment, evaluating learning, comes at the end of the learning, high stakes. Formative assessment, monitoring student learning, comes during the learning process, typically low stakes, low risk, low point value. Again, occurring during the learning process.